NATO is just a facade for American imperialist marching. The former US State Secretary John Kerry, who said that Macedonia, Serbia, and these countries in the so-called Western Balkans are on the front line, meaning front line of a future conflict, which means that they had it in the cards. I just cannot imagine that Macedonian elites simply deleted from their memory the fact that Yugoslavia was one of the major respected foreign policy players in a very critical period of time during the Cold War. The Ukraine-Russian war is actually something that many peace researchers and even people out of academia could easily predict and warned about the future developments. But sadly, few people in power centers listen to scholars or intellectuals or peace activists. The power centers actually already had the idea to escalate the situation, and they were not working for peace. And the whole story, narrative about NATO enlargement being a process of spreading Western democracy, values, peace, etc., was false, of course, because on the background, we can find many indications that this situation had been prepared. So in 2014, when Euromaidan took place, that was a colored revolution, of course, but few observers or analysts would notice that right after the Ukrainian colored revolution, the next one was Macedonia. My country is a part of former Yugoslavia, but the way to NATO and EU integrations was obstructed by our southern neighbor Greece, who objected the name of the country, Macedonia. So due to this problem, which is very emotional and very important for the people, because we have no other reserved identity but being what we are, and we consider ourselves Macedonians, many governments didn't even try to really change the name or do something radical in this sense. So the colored revolution actually helped remove the previous government that was stubborn, that didn't want to follow the guidelines from the West. And West got nervous, actually, and didn't want this small, tiny little country to spoil their grand strategy. Macedonia is not important per se. It's a very small territory, just 2 million people, but it makes a problem in the entire Balkan puzzle. So let me remind us that in 2005, almost 2 decades ago, it was the former US State Secretary John Kerry who said that Macedonia, Serbia, and these countries in the so-called Western Balkans are on the front line, meaning front line of a future conflict, which means that they had it in the cards. Everything is interlinked. What happened in Ukraine is followed in Macedonia. Macedonia got into NATO, and that is presented as some kind of achievement, some kind of contribution of the government that finally made this dream strategic goal achieved, for the people. Sadly, Ukraine paid much higher price than Macedonia. We paid with losing our sovereignty, our constitutional identity, our history. So this identity package is what we sacrificed on the altar of NATO membership, while Ukrainians are suffering really in terms of human loss, destruction, and all that. Everything could have been avoided, of course. I oppose NATO not only in my country, in Macedonia, but also in the entire region of former Yugoslavia, It is because of an obvious reason. If you have a region that suffered from terrible turmoil, bloody conflicts, and the consequences are still here, we still remember that it is still so fresh and painful for the societies. There is still no reconciliation. Young people are leaving, brain drain is massive. And people want to live a decent life. Why on earth military alliance? The problem with NATO is that NATO is unable and actually never promised to resolve the existential, social, economic, political, interethnic, or societal problems of these societies. So getting in alliance was promised here as some kind of miracle, some magic, that once we are in NATO, we are safe, we are going to be rich, everything will be perfect. So it was a fairy tale story for little children, not for adults. Now, when we are part of NATO, the irony is that we are a warring party in a proxy war. Macedonia is a poor country, and sadly, it belongs to 18 countries that are members of NATO who invest more than 2% of their GDP for military budget, not only for the membership fee to NATO, but also modernization of the army, and now military support for Ukraine. So we are investing from our poverty, supporting war, not peace. We, the people who know what war really means, are now joining a military crusade, and actually we are on the wrong side of history. We are in a worse situation than before. We are currently on the list of non-friendly countries of Russia. Why? Why should Macedonia, a small country, or even a bigger country, make enemies? Instead of making friendships, we are making enemies. And in a case of a nuclear holocaust or whatever, we are really on this front line. Due to the part that Yugoslavia fell apart, Macedonia, as a poor, tiny country with no statehood experience and traditions, really found itself in a very hard situation. There was a narrative against our own historical traditions and identities, saying that we need to be part of the West, that we are the West. But somehow during the communist times, we are not allowed, or we were part of a different interest sphere or whatever. The problem is that the Balkans is on a geographic position where civilizations have been meeting each other, crossing each other, influencing each other. So we cannot be just the West. We are also the East, or we have something of our own to offer the world. Nevertheless, the NATO and EU as strategic goals have been highest on the top agenda of the political elites. Elites who were incapable, corrupted, didn't or were unable to provide for the people to carry the basic human needs, to establish the normal, decent state and everything else. So this is like a religion. Let's believe this, not question it. This is the TINA principle. There is no alternative to NATO, to EU, to capitalism, open market, political liberalism. But then it was easy to adopt a new constitution and to make it copy-paste from the Western constitutions and to adopt some kind of parliamentary democracy. But it could not work in reality because the elections are a farce. The political elites are making love with the people, but they are always loyal to the international community, meaning the West. So in a region devastated by wars and conflicts, the Western powers came under the cloak of international community. They took over that name not rightly so, of course, because they never represented the entire world. And they promoted themselves into peace builders and state builders. We practically, with the end of history, the Fukuyama's famous phrase, we did not only lose our traditions and our past, but we also lost our agency, our right for political self-determination or any other type of deciding of our own future. We were treated as infantile societies that should be taught some elementary things. We are just fooling ourselves that we are living in democracy, that we are deciding on something. This is a region, sadly, where all the countries allegedly independent are actually colonies. There is a neocolonialism at place here. They would never take responsibility for the consequences. And we are the ones, the locals, who live with their consequences, with the consequences of their medicines. Western medicines produce iatrogenetic effects, which means they make the patient more sick than before. We spoke about the foreign policy. I just cannot imagine that Macedonian elites simply deleted from their memory the fact that Yugoslavia was one of the major respected foreign policy players in a very critical period of time during the Cold War. So it was possible. There was high quality diplomacy, knowledge about the world in its totality. I remember the time when I was proud of my country. That is something, to be proud of being Yugoslav or Macedonian, and these two were not in contradiction. You could be both, at the same time. It took me a while to understand that when we talk about resolving the problems in our societies or wider in the region, let alone globally, we face a very powerful complex. And that is the military, industrial, media, academia complex. Some colleagues mention even entertainment industry as something that make people distracted from reality, indulging some other games or whatever, just not to face what is really happening. The real diagnosis and the root problem here is that for the last more than 3 decades, as we are allegedly independent states, the Western power centers actually designed the minds of the elites who are, as I said, loyal. They taught them, to talk with their language, their rhetoric, to behave in that way. And then that spread into the media, who are not professional or objective. They're financed by the Western funds. We never hear anything about China, about developments, technological, cultural. Now we are seeing on Olympic Games how far has China's sport gone with a lot of successes and all that. And not only China, of course, but there is a world around, not only the West. But these political elites joined with the media elites. And unfortunately, my colleagues from the academia, they are all together. They are brown sahibs. They are, part of this colonial history where the colonial power would need local people to manage things, to administer territories. So these brown sahibs actually want to be Westerners, even if they are not. So this goes generation by generation. A country that is not allowed to have its internal sovereign home policy, it doesn't have foreign policy at all. I argue, and I can prove that a country like mine and Montenegro and Bosnia-Herzegovina or even Croatia, that is part of NATO and EU, they even think that they don't need a foreign policy because somebody else decides on the main roads of where we are going, where to invest, where to fight, whom to fight, who is the enemy, who is the friend. So the foreign policy is something that is a luxury, unfortunately, that we don't have. That is a brutal truth. The decline of the West is nothing new. It is a long-term process. It was maybe 20 years ago. We were talking about that as a prediction that something is going to happen with this society because it is not sustainable. It is based on violent culture. We can see that now in the elections. I mean, this looks like anything but democratic elections. Not to talk about growing social inequalities, poverty, homeless people on the streets, decadence in political and cultural sphere. So now they are going downhills. Not now, but for a long time. My only concern is that when empires in the past would come to an end, it would cost a lot of human lives. And that is what I'm not concerned about the future of United States. It is a concern of their citizens. But I'm concerned because of my safety and my security and of my people depends on the president of the United States more than of the president of my country. Because the impact of the American policy, as I mentioned, NATO is just a facade for American imperialist marching. NATO is growing into global NATO. They want to swallow the United Nations system. This is a madness. And of course, the price will be paid by ordinary people, by simple people, by a small country or bigger countries. Nevertheless, we will be all collateral damage of the fall of the empire.